precious songs and precious words. Let's take a seat there as we come to God's word together, which we'll read in just a moment. And it's a whole chapter of the book of Exodus. So let me just give a brief introduction, then I'm actually going to get Angie. Where's Angie? There she is. Angie's going to come up and read for us. If you need Bibles, there are Bibles. It will come up on the screen. You can take your phones out if you'd prefer, whatever you want to do. But good to have the text to follow along because it's a decent amount. And let me introduce it for us. So last week was our first in the series on Exodus. It's a book in the Old Testament. It's recording stories that were taking place some nearly 4,000 years ago in a foreign land, in Egypt, some way away from here. And of course, to get our heads around these stories of old that happened so long ago is beneficial because it's going to teach us what it means to be people who are saved and set free. We use those words a lot. Redeemed, saved, set free. If we want to understand what that even means, when we read those words, when we think about those, we need to look at these stories. So that's what we're doing in this book of Exodus. And just as a little bit of an introduction, which I know June gave us last week, but just to repeat for those who weren't with us, God's promised to his people through a guy called Abraham. It started with him, the patriarch Abraham. He said, listen, I'm going to make you a multitudinous people. You will be a big people. I'll make a nation out of you, and I will give you a land. And through you, and through this people, I will bless the nations of the whole world. So those are the promises, 3 in fact, that the Lord gave to Abraham. But things don't look great, because at the beginning of the book of Exodus, the numbers are small, but they grow quite quickly. God's people grow to quite a number, but they're in a foreign land. They're not on their own turf. They're actually in a foreign land in Egypt under a foreign king, Pharaoh, and their foreign gods, and under slavery and oppression. And what's more, because they've grown and become such a size, Pharaoh was worried. And he said, I can't be having this. This could amount to a rebellion. So I'll put these people under a regime whereby I'll tell the Egyptian midwives, if you assist with the birth of a baby boy amongst the Hebrews, you're to kill that child. Get rid of it. Destroy it. The midwives resist. That was if you didn't listen to the sermon last week from June, please go back and listen to it. The wonderful resistance of the midwives. But then Pharaoh just steps out even more and says, listen, okay, fine. Any citizen of Egypt, do your patriotic duty. If you see a Hebrew baby boy, throw it into the Nile. If you're a proud citizen of this country and you want to obey the orders of your king, you'll do what I say. Throw any Hebrew baby boy into the Nile. So that's the situation. That's the situation that God's people find themselves in. Such is life for the people of God, but there's hope with the birth of a baby. And we're going to read about that right about now. Angie, would you come up and read for us our scripture reading this morning? Thank you.
The reading is from Exodus 2 and can be found on page 59 of the Church Bibles. The birth of Moses. Now, a man of the tribe of Levi married a Levi woman, and she became pregnant and gave birth to a son. When she saw that he was a fine child, she hid him for 3 months. But when she could hide him no longer, she got a papyrus basket for him and coated it with tar and pitch. Then she placed the child in it and put it among the reeds along the bank of the Nile. His sister stood at a distance to see what would happen. Then Pharaoh's daughter went down to the Nile to bathe, and her attendants walking along the riverbank. She saw the basket among the reeds and sent her female slave to get it. She opened it and saw the baby. He was crying, and she felt sorry for him. "This is one of the Hebrew babies," she said. Then his sister asked Pharaoh's daughter, "Shall I go and get one of the Hebrew women to nurse the baby for you?" "Yes, go," she answered. So the girl went and got the baby's mother. Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Take this baby and nurse him for me, and I will pay you." So the woman took the baby and nursed him. When the child grew older, she took him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. She named him Moses, saying, "I drew him out of the water." Moses flees to Midian. One day, after Moses had grown up, he went out to where his own people were and watched them at their hard labor. He saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his own people. Looking this way and that and seeing no one, he killed the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. The next day he went out and saw two Hebrews fighting. He asked the one in the wrong, "Why are you hitting your fellow Hebrew?" The man said, "Who made you ruler and judge over us? Are you thinking of killing me as you killed the Egyptian?" Then Moses was afraid and thought, "What I did must have become known." When Pharaoh heard of this, he tried to kill Moses. But Moses fled from Pharaoh and went to live in Midian, where he sat down by a well. Now a priest of Midian had 7 daughters, and they came to draw water and fill the troughs to water their father's flock. Some shepherds came along and drove them away, but Moses got up and came to their rescue and watered their flock. When the girls returned to Reuel, their father, he asked them, "Why have you returned so early today?" They answered, "An Egyptian rescued us from the shepherds. He even drew water for us and watered the flock." "And where is he?" Reuel asked his daughters. "Why did you leave him? Invite him to have something to eat." Moses agreed to stay with the man, who gave his daughter Zipporah to Moses in marriage. Zipporah gave birth to a son, and Moses named him Gershom, saying, "I have become a foreigner in a foreign land." During that long period, the king of Egypt died. The Israelites groaned in their slavery and cried out, and their cry for help because of their slavery went up to God. God, hearing their groaning, he remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. So God looked on the Israelites and was concerned for them. This is the word of the Lord.
Thank you so much, Angie. Okay, 3 headings, 3 little headings as we go through this next section. And I want us to see this morning God's providence, his care. He's looking after Moses, yes, and his people. Through Moses' childhood, that's verses 1 to 10. Then in spite of Moses' foolishness and evil, that's 11 to 15. And then in the wilderness, that last section in Midian there, verses 16 to 22. So let's start with his childhood. The life of this baby boy, spared by the Egyptian midwives, of course, is still spared by them who don't kill him, then placed by his mum. So his mum recognizes, here's a baby boy, she reckons he's a fine-looking specimen of a child, and places him, interestingly, in a papyrus basket, which is otherwise known as an ark. The word there is ark. Just like the ark of Noah, back in Genesis, and places him amongst the reeds of the Nile, perhaps hoping, trusting, putting her confidence in the God of Noah. Would you rescue this baby boy? I can't look after him any longer. He'll be detected, so places him in the Nile in faith. Then a daughter in Pharaoh's household, out getting some vitamin D, bathing, whatever, notices this baby boy. And of course, as a loyal Egyptian citizen and member of the Pharaoh household, instantly orders this baby to be killed and thrown into the Nile. No. Decides, in contravention, actually, of the edict of the king, okay, I'll take on this Hebrew baby boy. And then this amazing thing happens because Moses' sister's there at the bank. She seizes on the opportunity, says, hey, I'll look after this baby. Do you want me to, I'll sort this out for you. I'll get this child weaned. if you'd like to do that. And so Pharaoh's daughter actually gives Moses, the baby, back to her mother, officially, like with the king's warrant. He's not going to be killed, and with a salary. So there he is, Moses, back with his mother. Jochebed, she's called. You find out that later on. With a salary. And the official edict of the king, oh, it's okay, that one can be spared. So amazing the way these events are working out. And then, of course, as Moses grows up, and he is weaned, and he's slightly older now, he returns to Pharaoh's daughter and the household of Pharaoh. Now, just appreciate, if you've ever been to the British Museum or a place like that, you'll know about Egypt in around about this time and this age. It was the superpower of the known world. Everything was happening there, architecturally, in engineering, in philosophy, in technology, everything, all the latest thinking, education was all taking place in ancient Egypt. And Moses is right in the middle of that, in the privilege and education and upbringing of the household of Pharaoh. Can you believe that? And presumably his education would have been in politics, statecraft, law, philosophy, and he'd have had the finest minds, the finest educators around him from a young age. Now think about what God's engineering here. He's preparing a candidate to lead a nation one day, and to write, as it's incidentally, to author the first 5 books of the Bible. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. All authored in some way, at least, by Moses. What providence that he's given a first-class education as a Pharaoh scholar in the household of the king of Egypt. Interesting, isn't it? But notice in this point, just at the end of this first point here, Moses hasn't done anything. In fact, if anything, you give credit to whom? Under God, of course, God's orchestrating this, but in this section, the credit is all to the women. Notice that? Midwives, chapter 1, verse 19, who exercise godly civil disobedience and refused to carry out the orders of Pharaoh. Moses' mother, who puts him in the reeds in faith, trusting God that he will undertake to protect this child. Pharaoh's daughter, of course, who does what is right and doesn't kill him, but instead takes him on. And Moses' sister, who's there at the opportune time to say, hey, I'll look after the child. I'll make sure this child's looked after. So all women. Worth noticing, because it's a day and age, isn't it, where we go back over texts like the Bible and other historic texts and just paint them with a very broad brush. Oh, it's a product of its time, has no concern or no equality amongst the sexes. Well, it is a little bit more nuanced than that when you read the Bible, which speaks very highly, in this case, of the faith and civil disobedience of women who exercised in this first portion great leadership, care, concern, righteousness, doing what is right and good in the Lord's eyes. So that's the first point. Providence through Moses' childhood. The providence of God there. Number 2, providence at work in spite. This second section now, verses 11 to 15, in spite of a very foolish, wicked, evil decision of Moses. So Moses is it's midlife crisis. Moses is probably in his late 30s at this point. So he's done a fair bit of life up to this stage. Maybe, I don't know, let's put him at 38. I don't know, something like that. And perhaps he's not quite sure what he's doing. Who am I? You know, most people go through this kind of thought process maybe in their teens or whatever. But here he is in his 30s. And for some reason, something's changing now. So he knows he's a Hebrew. I'll tell you one way he knows. Now, on the 8th day Every Hebrew child that was born, there was a certain chop that went on. So, not to be crude about it, but every time Moses goes to the toilet, he knows. He knows he's been marked out as a Hebrew. And at the same time, perhaps 40 years in the luxury and the lavishness of the household of Pharaoh, perhaps just after that time he's a little bit disillusioned with it all. I don't know. But interestingly, in Hebrews, so later on in the Bible, in the last section of the Bible, the book of Hebrews, just listen to these verses from Hebrews 11. This is 24 to 26. This is how it describes Moses at this point. Have a listen to this. By faith, Moses, when he had grown up, refused to be known as the son of Pharaoh's daughter. He chose to be mistreated along with the people of God rather than to enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin. There's Pharaoh's household. He regarded disgrace for the sake of Christ as of greater value than the treasures of Egypt, because he was looking ahead to his reward. So here's possibly a bit of a conversion moment for Moses, perhaps. He chooses in this moment, maybe here, to trust, to put his faith in the God of Israel and to make God's people, this oppressed, weak, mistreated, disgraced people, his people and his treasure. I'll treasure these people. And I'll look forward to God's future, his great reward, his new creation. So somehow he makes a bit of a decision for God and his people here. But his first big move, think about this. His first tangible move, the first thing he does for God is disastrous. An absolute disaster. So he sees, maybe he's out walking in the land. He sees there's an Egyptian mistreating, beating a Hebrew. Blood boils. He can't bear it. And so he murders him. He murders this Egyptian and buries him in the sand. Now stop here. Here's Moses, perhaps on his first season of faith in the Lord, and he's not immune from making a catastrophic mistake in his life. And I think that's an encouragement, because it's true for us as Christians as well. As we step out in faith for God, we're not immune. We're not going to be immune from making really, really foolish decisions. But the beauty of the story here is that God works even or in spite of a life-changingly foolish and wicked decision, taking things into his own hands and dealing with things in the worst possible way. Murder and a cover-up. He thinks, this is the way I'll get the job done round here. It's a terrible decision. But God's going to use even this to do something formative in Moses' life. Now notice this puts him in a very, very horrible position, because verses 13 to 14, the Hebrews see this, so God's people in Egypt see this, and you get this little exchange where two of them are fighting. Did you spot that bit in the story? Two of the Hebrews now are fighting, and Moses is like, what are you doing? Stop fighting each other. And one of them says to Moses, who made you ruler and judge over us? You going to kill me as well, like you killed that Egyptian? So God's people, the Hebrews, Moses gets the sense, these people are rejecting me. They don't want me. They don't want me as their ruler, or they don't want me anywhere near them. Similarly, Pharaoh, verse 15, he wants him dead now because he's killed an Egyptian. And so he's got no choice. Rejected by the Egyptians, rejected by the Hebrews, he has to go on the run. And out he goes, forced into exile, forced into the wilderness and the desert land of Midian. So just summary, that middle point, that second point there, Moses' first step of faith, disaster. Absolute disaster. Foolish decision with life-changing consequences. He has no choice but to leg it. And now he's in the wilderness, midlife, 40 years old. Something like that. But God's providence is still in this. Still working through these events in this young Moses' life. So finally, third point. God's providence in the wilderness. This is verses 16 to 22. So 40 years now, from the age of around about 40 in Moses' life to 80, he's now going to be in the desert. He's going to have to get to know that desert. In fact, later on, of course, he's going to lead God's people out through the desert. So the Lord's given him a 40-year recce of the desert, readying him for that phase. But the main training in this life, in this part of his life, this phase, right? So phase 1, Pharaoh's household, the best education that money could buy. Phase 2, 40 years of sheep, verse 17. And becoming a shepherd. Marriage, verse 21, to Zipporah. Fatherhood to 2 sons, Gershom's mentioned here. And time, a lot of it. Verse 23, 40 years. So phase 2 training. Look at what God does here. Shepherding, husbandry, fathering children, and doing that over a span of 40 years. That's what you need. We're not going to do it your way, Moses, killing people, murdering them out of anger. We're going to do it my way, like a shepherd, like a husband, like a father. That's the way we're going to do this. Now, just one thing to notice before we conclude. In this chapter, the whole of chapter 2, and Moses 80 years to this point. Moses is going to live to 120, by the way. So the dramatic part of his life doesn't happen before he's 80, the last third of his life. But for the first 80 years of his life, nothing particularly supernatural. No signs and wonders, but God absolutely at work. Absolutely at work. Through the midwives, through Pharaoh's daughter and Moses' sister and Moses' mother, through the events of his foolish decisions and everything he's doing with the Egyptian, through the wilderness and everything that he'll go through there as a father, a husband, and a shepherd. God's at work. So important. And had you have met, I just imagine you went out to the desert and Moses was about, let's say, 79. And you'd taken him for a Starbucks, because obviously they have got Starbucks. And you buy it because he's had a bit of a hard knock life. So you pay for his latte with a hazelnut shot. And you say to him, look, Moses, how are you doing? I'd imagine he'd have said at that point, I had the best education that money could buy, the most privileged upbringing. I haven't used it much. And then he might have said, I was so zealous for God in my 30s. I had a real passion and zeal for the Lord, but I made a total mess of that. And so I've spent the last 40 years here. And all that zeal and all that energy and all that I thought was going to be achieved, I haven't really done very much. And what must the people of God have thought? Right? Remember, this is now 80 years of infanticide. 80 years. Right? So from the moment that Pharaoh gave the order, kill every newborn baby boy in the Hebrews, to this point where Moses is 80 years of it. 80 years of that. 40 years of that for Moses in the wilderness. Now listen, I get sick and tired if it takes 40 seconds for them to do my burger at McDonald's or whatever. 40 years. 80 years for God to work his purposes out for his people through his servant Moses. It's a long stretch. But God does hear, and he remembers, he sees, and he knows. Did you get that verse? If you've got it in front of you, just look at it, verse 24. I wonder if we've got it on the screens. Verse 24, God hears. See that? God hears their groaning. He remembers his covenant. He sees, he looks on. Next verse, he sees their suffering. He looks on. And he was concerned, or literally in the Hebrew, he knew. He knew. And he's working his purposes out. So to conclude, do you know Romans 8:28? It is possibly the most important pastoral verse in the whole Bible. Do you know it? It's the one we often quote, Romans 8:28, so important. It goes like this, and we know that in all things, God works for the good of those who love him and who are called according to his purpose. Romans 8:28. In all things, the good and the bad, the hard, the difficult, the rubbish, in all things, God works for the good of those who love him. And here you have, in Exodus chapter 2, a fine, maybe one of the finest examples of that in all the Bible. Of God taking a life and working through every phase. Childhood, mistakes, wilderness. To bring about good purposes. For Moses, yes, and for God's people. If you'd have spoken to Moses at 38 or 78, he might not have known what on earth was going on with his life. He might have thought, what is God's purposes in this, sending me out to the wilderness? What is God's purposes for me at 78 years old? I don't know what I'm doing out here in the wilderness. If you'd have asked him then, he'd have been just like open-palmed. I don't know what God is doing, but my life pretty much amounts to certainly nothing that he might have imagined, having had such a start in the household of Pharaoh and so much promise around his life. But the providence of God is at work. And we need to know that. You may say to me, look, it often does come up in conversations. Perhaps you speak to me, perhaps you speak to others. I don't know why. Why has God given me this dead-end job? Why have I lost these people in my life because they've died at such a young age? Why am I facing this ill health? Why am I dealing with these situations? I don't know. I don't know. I wouldn't have been able to answer that question for Moses when he was 40. I don't know what's going on. But you look at the broad sweep of life in the providence of God, in his sovereign care. And you can see Exodus chapter 2. Here is a God who is working his purposes out. So don't let what you don't know torpedo what you do know. Let me say that again. Don't let what you don't understand and don't know about God in your life torpedo what you do know. Which is that in all things, God is working out good things for those who love him and who have been called according to his purpose. I'm going to stop there and just give you actually a moment's quiet, maybe 3 or 4 minutes or so, just as I prepare to receive here at this table the Lord Jesus in the bread and in the wine. Let me just give you a few moments to ponder and to pray.